Okay, so on previous videos, I've gone through the use of multipass, which is a great little tool by the Colloquial community, if I've pronounced that right, the makers of Ubuntu, to allow you to spin up lots of VMs using a cloud init file to set defaults on them, and that's great for practicing with, tools like Ansible. Um, Chef, any other kind of configuration management tool. It's also a great way to spin up some virtual machines if you wanted to start configuring your own Kubernetes cluster. You want to take that Kubernetes administrator exam, and you need to go through all the steps of manually setting up a Kubernetes cluster. What we're going to look at here is a tool called minikube. What we're working towards here is we want to get into Azure Kubernetes services, and we really want to start doing some cool stuff with that service within Azure. But before that, I still want to learn more about Kubernetes and containerization, and I want to do that without spending any money at all. So a great way to get started is using a tool called minikube. So minikube is extremely easy to use. There are some configurations behind it that may require you to learn some concepts about Kubernetes clusters, but it's really not too difficult, and it's a great place to start. What I would note before we dive into this is these are the things we need to do to set up our Kubernetes environment so we can test and play around with it. But this is not what you would do in Azure. In Azure, you would go and create a resource. You want to understand some of the similar concepts, but once you create that Kubernetes cluster resource, that's kind of taken care of for you. So the first thing you want to do is install minikube. Now, I've already got it installed, but it's really simple. If you go to the minikube website and you follow the documentation, you'll find so many ways to install it. The easiest one I like to use is Chocolatey. So Choco install minikube. I should get a message just saying it's already installed, so I could do a force to reinstall. But I'm happy that I've got it installed. So let me run minikube on the command line and get a whole list of commands. Minikube commands are focused around how we spin up, configure, and bridge our connection to a virtual Kubernetes cluster that is just going to run locally on my machine. Now, I'm going to start with out of the box, just how to run it. So you literally do minikube start. What it should hopefully do, it's automatically selected the Docker driver. It's I assume it's either detected I have Docker installed, or that's just the default it goes with if you don't ask it to do anything else. Now it's going away, it's pulling down some base images to support that. If I open up my Docker interface for a moment, you see there's no containers currently running, but hopefully in a bit of short order, we should start to see a container appear. And there it is. It's been given one of its fantastic random Docker names. And then so that was one intermediate image that then either created or was renamed to minikube. So minikube is the name of our Docker image. We'll give it a moment just to finish firing itself up. Okay, so that's it, we're done. What does that mean we're done? Well, we now have a Docker image running that is running a virtual Kubernetes cluster for us, a single node cluster, if you will. We've had to do nothing other than say minikube start. Well, how do I verify this? Well, it will have automatically put my connection into my kube config file. So I'm going to go ahead and be lazy and use my lens tool, which basically just looks at my kube config anyway, but we can see there we've got minikube in. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin this and connect to it. There we go. There's my cluster. So I can do kubectl get nodes. You can see it's one single node. Let's do a wide output for that. Okay, you can see it's got its own internal IP. There's no external IP. It's Ubuntu 20.04 that's sat underneath that. That's it. I have a cluster. So what can I do with this cluster? Well, let's create ourselves a very simple deployment. So let me just go to the default namespace. You can see there, if I actually put that back, you can see under all namespaces, all the kind of things you would expect to see. The core DNS, the etcd, the API server, the controller, the proxy, they're all there. We've got, you can see they're all minikube flavors of this. We've got a storage provisioner in there. We've also got, I thought there was another one. There's another one we'll see eventually, which is related to the kube control dashboard, but we'll come back to that. Let's fire up a workload. Easiest thing to do. I'm going to create an Nginx deployment. I'm just going to steal that from elsewhere, so I can be extremely lazy. Okay, so we're going to say kube control, create deployment. The deployment's going to be called Nginx. I'm going to call it my Nginx, and the image I'm going to use is going to be Nginx. The latest one will be pulled down from Docker Hub. It'll just be the latest version. Okay, deployment created. So I'm in my default namespace, so let me close that up now. We can see there's a deployment there with replicas of 1. And if we go and we look at the pods, we can see there is my Nginx, and that pod is running. Great, happy days. Okay, now I can't do anything with that unless I create a service. My service is going to allow me to get in to access that Nginx server. So I do kube control create service node port. I'm going to call it my Nginx. And then there's my ports. Let's change one of these up. I never remember which way round it goes. Is it this way? Let's do 1, 2, 3. Okay, so the service has been created. So we go to the service, my Nginx. It's the node port is serving on port 80, which means it's trying to map that, translate that to port 1, 2, 3 internally, which is incorrect. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. I did get my numbers the wrong way around. I'm going to go for port 1, 2, 3 here on my node port. Okay, and that ultimately is going to map into port 80 against the my Nginx deployment. So how can we test that? Now, here's the quirk with this out-of-the-box deployment of minikube. If we look at the nodes here, we don't have an external IP. So I actually have no IP address where I can go and try and hit that. Indeed, if I even just tried to do port 1, 2, 3, I mean, it's just nowhere. It's nowhere to be found. So this is where with minikube, you want to basically create a tunnel. So it with the Docker configuration, it actually needs to be running. I'll just type it out and I'll show you. It's easier to talk to. So you can see here we've got minikube tunnel, which connect to a load balancer services. So let's give that a go. Okay. Give it a minute to set things up. It basically configures a level of routing on my machine here. That is going to allow us to tunnel into the minikube cluster. I'm not sure if it should actually be giving me some output there. Let's have a look if anything's going on here. Nothing. So let's just try hitting that endpoint again. Nothing. Clearly either something's not working or I'm missing an option there. So let me cancel out that. Let's run the help. That's in options. Creates a router services deployed with type load balancer and sets their ingress to their cluster IP. So I didn't deploy a load balancer, I deployed a node port, so tunnel doesn't work for me. However, there is a minikube service command. I have deployed a service. So regardless of whether it's a load balancer or node port, it doesn't really matter. So if I do minikube service, I'm pretty sure it's just the URL parameter we need to provide here. It is, so we can say URL is what we want. And then we want to give it the name of the service. So the name of my service is my Nginx. Okay. Now it's going to tell me here saying, okay, I've started a tunnel for that service. That service target is now available on this URL. Because you are using a Docker driver on Windows, the terminal needs to be open to run it. So this is basically a blocking command now. But if I follow this URL, you can see I've gone straight through and I've hit that Nginx workload. Right? Pretty cool. So let me go back here. If I Control-C to cancel out with that now, it's going to have killed that route. So I come back here and refresh, and it's going to think for a little bit and then fail. Okay. So that's a slight limitation of the Docker image, and we'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to show you one other really cool feature. If you run minikube dashboard, it's going to, first time, it's actually going to provision the resources in the cluster. But what it's basically doing here, let me go back, it's made sure that the services are running, the workloads are running in the Kubernetes cluster. It's then launching a proxy, which is the same kind of thing. It's this kind of tunnel. And it's given me a port on my local host to be able to hit for that. And then it's given me a URL to go to. It's actually launching it for me. And this is a great little dashboard just to be able to look in and see everything that is running within the cluster. So if you don't have a tool like Lens, or you don't want to use a tool like that, or you just want to quickly look in, just run minikube dashboard, and this will come up. Fantastic. Okay, same thing applies. That's a blocking tool. So if I cancel that and come back, this dashboard is no longer going to be accessible. Okay. So what if we want to pause this? What if it is killing our machine and we want to get on with some real work? We can just do a minikube pause. You see the Docker container should shortly, does it actually pause the container? I don't think it does. I think it's just paused the 18 containers that are running in it. So I think it's minikube resume. Okay, and then those containers will start running again. So let me just do that again. Let's go look at the pods. It said it was pausing them. It's not really reflecting in the status here, but you can see, well, I mean, of course, this is going to not respond. This is just going to be cached workload because the Kube API server itself will be paused. So, you know, truly it is not doing anything at the moment. The other thing is if we want to just tear this down, we can do a minikube delete. We can do a minikube stop, which I think will actually stop the container. You can see it's going through its stop process there, and it's stopped and it's now exited, but it's still there. So I could do start again and it would restart that. But let's do minikube delete. and it's going to clean up all those resources. Okay, and then also if I go back to lens now, you see this is kind of grayed out because the configuration has been removed from my cube config file as well. Okay. Now what I want to show you is how we can create minikube using Hyper-V instead. So I've got my Hyper-V set up here. Let's go to the documentation for this. We're going to go under drivers, and drivers, if you recall, it said minikube can be deployed. To do so, we use the Docker machine library, and the default is Docker, right? But it also supports on Windows Hyper-V. So we'll go to Hyper-V here. There's this enable Windows optional feature. All this is doing is if you do turn Windows features on and off, there's a Hyper-V option here. If this isn't ticked, you won't have Hyper-V set up on your machine. I think you need Windows 10 Pro to be able to do that if you're using a Win 10 box. But this is just a PowerShell command to do exactly the same thing. You may have to reboot if you have just installed it for the first time. What we're going to do, there's two things you can do. You can tell minikube to set Hyper-V as the default driver. So then every time you do minikube start, it will always use Hyper-V. Or you can just launch it with the driver in the command line there as well. So it will, the default will still be Docker, but in this instance, I'm going to use Hyper-V. Now I'm going to go a little bit further along here and just show you a couple of other options. We can tell it to use a particular virtual switch. I have sometimes fired this up, and because I don't have a working default virtual switch, I've run into issues. So I prefer to tell it which virtual switch to connect to. I've just got an external NAT here to my Wi-Fi, to my LAN controller. So, and it's just called external wired. So I can literally just go in and add that in and put its name in, external wired. And then another thing that's good to do, if you happen to have a lot of CPU cores, which I think most people do now, I think the default is to use 2, which is going to be, you know, what's that, 1/16 of my total compute power. That sometimes can be a bit slow here. There is an option. Let's go to commands where there's more detail. Commands, start, and in here there's CPUs, number of CPUs allocated. Okay, so I'm going to set that to 8. So it should be at max load, it should be using about 50% of my overall compute power. Okay, give that a run. Okay, it's going, downloading the latest images, ISO images. You can see it's creating the Hyper-V there. It's got the CPU set to 8. If I switch over to Hyper-V here, in a moment or two, I should start to see a new machine. I do. There it is, minikube. And then it may take a minute or two just to start up. So exactly the same concept here as we did with Docker, except now the machine has been running in Hyper-V. The distinct advantage we have here in a Windows environment, which is really what I was going for, is I have connected this to a particular virtual switch, and in my case I've set to an external one, so its interface is reaching out to my home router and saying, give me an IP address, I need to talk to the world. In doing that, this has been assigned an IP address. So that issue where we had to tunnel before, we no longer have to do that. You know, this virtual machine now that's running my simulated cluster is running on this IP address. And there's many different ways you can get access to that. We'll revisit them in a moment. Let's just wait for this to finish starting up. It's normally about a minute and a half. Okay, nearly there. Okay, verifying the configuration and the components. Okay, it's done. Cube controller is now configured to use minikube cluster and default namespace by default. So it's added those configurations back to my cube config file. And so I can see my minikube again. And it's actually set as the default in cube control. So let's go ahead and connect to this again. Okay, let's do a cube call get nodes. Let's output that in the wide format. Oh, typo. And you can see here, well, it still shows external IP as none. I actually thought it would show me it there, which is, oh, sorry. We can go off of the internal IP. Previously, the internal IP was within the Docker networking, container networking. Now this internal IP is showing as my actual virtual machine IP, which makes sense. So let's go ahead and stick a workload on. Let's be lazy and go back through this. So there's create the deployment. Let's create the service. Okay, so there's my deployment. Let's go for the default namespace. There's the pod to support that deployment. There's my service. And now, I mean, even just looking at Hyper-V and seeing this IP address, I should be able to just hit that in my browser on the port that I expose the service on. Well, not necessarily that I expose the service on, that the node port is configured for. So save me making an embarrassing mistake. Let me actually just use the same minikube command we did before. Minikube service. Get me the URL for my Nginx. Okay, so it's a node port. I'm not using a load balancer of any sort. So it's told me this is the port that that service is exposed on from the internal IP perspective. So I can take that. You can see that is the same IP address that was assigned to my Hyper-V machine, and we're straight into Nginx. Okay, so you can see this is not blocking because this, in this case, the service command, it's not having to set up any kind of tunnel. It is literally just interrogating the configuration and saying, hey, this is the node port number that this service is exposed on. So let's try something else now. You'll see there's no minikube dashboard in there. So let's do the same thing, minikube dashboard. So it's going to enable it. We should very soon see that. So there's the minikube. Oh, there's the minikube dashboard services. And there's the one in particular that we're accessing. And you can see that we are still working on localhost. And if we go back to the command prompt, we can see that this URL is being tunneled. There is a proxy again for that. Now, if we exit out of that command, again, we're going to lose that proxy. So we're going to lose access to that dashboard. I'm going to try something and I have no idea if it's going to work, but let's give it a go. So if we compare this to the default namespace where we created a service that exposed based on a node port, I'm wondering if I can do the same thing for the dashboard. So we can see there's a selector there. This is maybe a little more involved. So let's okay. Let's save this as service.yaml. Okay, I'm going to clear out some of the stuff that doesn't matter. Status, we do want the spec, we do want the selector. I don't know, I want to tell it any of that information. In fact, I don't. Yeah, we need to tell it a target port, I guess. Okay. So let's call it Kubernetes dashboard service. Node port service. Same namespace. We don't need any of those. Don't believe we need any. Well, we'll leave the application. Okay. So now instead we want this to be node port. And that was a lot of effort, but it's just doing this selector is a bit easier for me to do it this way. So this is our dashboard service. Let's go in and let's say kubectl create, well, apply dash service. Okay, so we've now got a Kubernetes dashboard node port service. So let's copy the name of that and let's say that the port's displayed for me right in front of me there, but let's test minikube anyway. Minikube service URL for the name of that service. You do not have, oh, I'm sorry. I'm running this in my lens, which is not an elevated command prompt. Let me try that again here. Existing due to service not found. It was not found in the default namespace. So I need to tell it the namespace, which is Kubernetes dashboard. Or I could have just said minikube service list and got them all. That maybe would have helped. Okay, so it's given me the node port, which matches here, the 31358. So my question is, and I definitely never tried this before, if I switch this out here, will it work? No. Well, there we go. Oh, actually it does. It's just, it looks like that path routing is different. Very interesting. Okay, well, that was a pretty cool demonstration of how that actually works. If we go in here now, we should be able to see, if I fix the namespace, we can see there's our Nginx. Okay. And then if I want to just stop this, let's do minikube stop. Switch to Hyper-V. You should very soon see it starting to close itself down. I think it's going to put it in the save state. Oh, it's actually going to shut the machine down. Okay, I'm no longer using resources. That's it. That's minikube. I think it's a fantastic tool. Once you have it up and running, you can really start to play with all the tools and the Helm charts and the definition files that ultimately we're going to use again when we move to Azure Kubernetes Services. So I hope that was insightful. Please play around with it, and I'll see you on the next video.